Welcome, everyone. I'd like to wish you a good afternoon, a good evening, a good morning. I know you're tuning in from all over the world today for our presentation, and we're so excited to have you. I'm Sion Winship. I'm president of the Society of Architectural Historians, Southern California chapter. For some of you who may be new to the organization and haven't attended our programs before, we are the largest chapter of an international organization, the Society of Architectural Historians. We've been around about something like 50 years here in Southern California, and we are fueled by an enthusiastic board of about 7 or 8 people who help put on programming and administer the business of the SAH SCC. And we so appreciate you taking some time out of your day to attend this program with us. But today, we are here to celebrate this book, as you can see, When Brains Meet Buildings, with one of the greatest cover photos, I think, of almost any of the books that we have featured on this program. I just love it. And I want to tell you, we do have a lot of new people joining us today, so I just want to tell you a little bit about how the run of show goes for these programs. It's pretty simple. So our author today will talk and do a PowerPoint presentation for 45 minutes, an hour or so, something like that. And then we will open it up to all of you for Q&A. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started by introducing our esteemed presenter today. I unfortunately, if I could took the time to read all of his accolades, his achievements, his degrees, and the books and papers he's written, that in and of itself would take an hour. So I'm going to try to just hit the highlights. Michael Arbib was born in England, but he grew up in Australia. He earned a BSc with honors in pure mathematics from Sydney University, and he received his PhD in mathematics from MIT in 1963. So after 5 years at Stanford, he founded the PhD program in the Department of Computer and Information Science at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 1970. He then joined the University of Southern California in 1986, and was the Fletcher Jones Professor of Computer Science, as well as a Professor of Biological Sciences, Biomedical Engineering, Electrical Engineering, Neuroscience, and Psychology when he retired from USC in 2016, and he holds a well-deservedly Professor Emeritus status there. He is also currently an Adjunct Professor of Psychology at the University of California in San Diego, and he's the author of a number of academic papers and books beyond this brand new one here. But the books include Brains, Machines, and Mathematics, and How the Brain Got Language, in addition to this brand new work. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Michael. Michael, you should be the host now, and if you want to, you can share your screen.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sian, and welcome to all of you who are online now or will be viewing this later. I want to make 2 points about the cover of the book that you see here. The first is that the subtitle is A Conversation Between Neuroscience and Architecture. And by that I mean that rather than tell architects they need to know neuroscience, or neuroscientists that they need to know architecture, the idea is that each can learn from conversation with the other. And I've tried to represent the ideas of many different architects and relate them to my own ideas about neuroscience in the hope that this conversation will be engaging not only to architects and neuroscientists, but also to a much broader public, of which many of you represent. The other thing is a note on the cover. In trying to take this rather ponderous notion of when brains meet neuroscience and architecture, I boiled it down to when brains meet buildings. And it was only a year or so later that I recognized that I had this photo, which I'd taken when walking down Unter den Linden in Berlin and looking up a side street. And it could not better express how brains meet buildings. Okay, so that's the background. For the book itself, I want to start by going a little bit into my own development because I think it will give you a sense of how I approach the conversation rather than the way in which perhaps another neuroscientist might do so. So in thinking about it, after I'd written the book, I remembered that certain things had happened in my teenage years that might have been subconscious influences. One is that I had this Baco set where I could take various pieces and assemble them into different types of model building. And I even remember correspondence with the manufacturers suggesting new building blocks. Second, a book that I very much regret I lost somewhere in the moves. All I remember is it had a yellow cover and was about British architecture with an emphasis on brutalism. And the third is that my dad was the co-director or managing director of a company called Australian Steel Prefabrications. And his experience there made him a master builder of prefabricating buildings in a factory to meet his designs for both factories in the rural areas, in the urban areas of Australia, and shearing sheds and other such things in the rural areas. But as an undergraduate, my real love started as pure mathematics, the elegance of theorems, and the proofs that led to them. And it was not until fairly late in my undergraduate career that I was corrupted by this book, Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics, Controlling Communication in the Animal and the Machine. And I became totally intrigued with using this idea of the brains, as it were, of animals and machines as the target for my further work in mathematics. And a few years later, that led to the lectures I gave at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, in Australia, titled Brains, Machines and Mathematics. They became my first book, put out in 1964. But that was a somewhat derivative book, more what I had read put together in somewhat narrative form. And it wasn't until 1972 that I published the first book, which began to develop my own view of what studying the brain was about. And the book was called The Metaphorical Brain. And note the subtitle, An Introduction to Cybernetics as Brain Theory and Artificial Intelligence. And so my interest was this: how do we understand how human brains work? How can we do it at two levels, what we might call cognitive science, where we say, well, I want to understand what sort of processes could yield human behavior and experience, but not really worrying about the brain data, or brain theory, computational neuroscience. How can we really link those underlying processes to data on the brain? And finally, artificial intelligence, with the idea that we're trying to see how we could make machines do a fragment of intelligence. And to some extent, that might be inspired by what we learn from brain theory or cognitive science. To some extent, it might be just investigations by computer scientists for themselves. But my own particular take on developing my work within that framework was what we call computational but neuroethology. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. Neuroethology, what brain mechanisms make animals behave the way they do. Computational, how can we develop computer models of that? And in this diagram, 4 of the creatures have had some play in my development of my understanding of the brain. And I stress that, of course, when I say my development, it means that many experimentalists were coming up with new data on animal brains or human brains. Other modelers were trying to make computational sense of this, and my group contributed many of the models to that. So start with the frog. That turned out to be the place to really get my basic understanding of the notion that perception is not just a pure process. What do we see, but is action-oriented. How do we see so that we can behave within the world as it currently is? And intriguingly, perhaps, you'll find in the book, though not in this talk, an account of how our modeling of the brain of the frog might actually yield insights relevant to some of Le Corbusier's work on the aesthetics of spatial arrangement. The second creature you'll see here in this progression is the rat. And some of you know that Place cells were discovered in the hippocampus of the rat, cells that seem to respond best to where the animal was in its world. And it turns out, though, that if you try to make a good computational analysis of that, you have to bring in many other parts of the brain and not just the region where those place cells are connected. And in the book, that gets connected to ideas about episodic memory, if you will, where you are in time to match where you are in space and what the implications might be for design. Onto the monkey. As you'll see in a moment, I've been very much concerned with the link between vision and action, particularly action of the hand. And this led into work by Rizzolatti and his colleagues in Parma in Italy on mirror neurons. And again, as the modeling progressed, we made clear that it's not enough to just look at mirror neurons by themselves. You need a more systems-wide view of what mirror neurons do with other brain regions to explain how it is that, for example, we recognize the action of others or have empathy for the action of others. In any case, to close this slide, building on that, I developed an account of how the brain got language, which looks at how perhaps the control of hand movements rather than the control of speech played the crucial role in our biological evolution, and that opened the gates to cultural evolution, whereby humans have the languages they do today. Okay, but that's the background. What about the link to architecture as distinct from those forgotten childhood memories? Well, the crucial turning point was this effort in 2002 by colleagues in computational neuroscience in Zurich, who put together a space called ADA, the interactive space, for the 2002 Swiss Expo in Lausanne in Switzerland. And as you can see from the pictures here, one of the notable features is that there are tiles which can change color. And in particular, they can detect whether a person is standing on the tile. It can detect people's movement by seeing touch on adjacent tiles. And so we end up with a system which could track people, could change color to bring people given the same color together, engage them in games, and then gently guide them towards the exit. So this was perhaps the first example. There are other precursors, but the first example of what we call neuromorphic architecture. And the idea that you don't simply have a building, but in some sense the building has a brain, although further discussion would make it clear that some aspects of that, quotes, brain, end quotes, are indeed informed by study of real animal or human brains, whereas others are exercised in artificial intelligence. And I think many people by now have smart devices in their home. And so in the 20 years since this Swiss Expo, we've seen the beginning of neuromorphic architecture, but I would say still it's more, you have architecture as it has always been, and you throw some appliances in the home linked to the network, the integration of different creatures with the web, the network of things, rather than changing architecture itself. So one of the topics that I won't talk about today, but is covered in chapter 7 of the book, is where are we in neuromorphic architecture? Where might we be going? So I really became an active participant in the conversation between architecture and neuroscience in 2011, when I had joined the ANFA, the Academy of Architecture for Neuroscience, and was invited to give a talk in 2011, where I adapted the title of my first book to talk about brains, machines, and buildings. It was my introduction to a formal exposition of neuromorphic architecture. But I want to make one important caveat here. Thanks to the observation of my son, Ben, you see on the left not only a picture of the spinal cord from John St. Agatai, but a picture of Ken Yang's IBM tower. And it was a cute, if you will, visual pun that the two rather resemble each other. But in fact, this is not neuromorphic architecture, because I emphasize the notion is not how do you get something that looks like a brain, like the philological library at the Free University in Berlin, but rather how can thinking about the way in which an animal interacts with its world, senses, effectors, and brains to link them, give us new insights into developments in architecture. Okay, and then we're almost at the end of the background before we get into the nitty-gritty of the material in the book. And that is that shortly after my ANFA talk, the then president of ANFA, Alison Whitelaw, recommended to Sarah Robinson that she asked me to talk at her symposium at Taliesin West. And 4 people in the end were invited, and the keynote, the first of the keynotes was by Juhani Ballasmaa, the Finnish architect and architectural scholar. And I had been influenced by that time by reading several of his books. And so I decided that I would make my talk a response to his book, The Thinking Hand, by linking it to my book on how the brain got language, where I built on the studies of linking vision and hand via imitation and pantomime and gesture and sign language to the biological and cultural evolution of language, and then reflecting back on then how an understanding of these brain systems would link symbolism and language, as well as the art of drawing and so on, to the work of the architect. And to tie it all together, a few months later, Juhani arranged a workshop in Helsinki, where we were joined by Harry Malgrave, whose book on the architect's brain had been very influential in my thinking up to that time, and of course in later years. So with this, everything was in place. We not only had neuromorphic architecture, which I've already mentioned, I won't get into today to leave time about the crucial interaction on the left of the diagram, that the design of buildings shapes and is informed by the experience of buildings. And so it's that loop between design and experience within the context of architecture that takes our attention. And then the concern is, how can neuroscience in its broad sense, with insights from particularly cognitive science, but also artificial intelligence, inform us in understanding what's going on there? And again, I reiterate, the idea is that it's a conversation. It doesn't mean that everything the architect knows, or that you experience in a building is already explained by the neuroscientist, or that everything that architects and experience in buildings involves is relevant to our understanding of the brain. But there are, I claim, many interesting facets within each field, architecture and neuroscience, that can engage with each other in conversation. So this is just a list of the 10 chapters. I'm not going to get into that. Each of them could form the basis for several talks in itself. Instead, I want to focus on just 5 issues where I'm going to take ideas from broad sense neuroscience, and then give you an exposition of what I think is the key idea involved, and where possible, give some relationship to architecture. And the idea is that each of these is an invitation to further conversation rather than an end in itself. So let's just go through these titles one at a time and see what it means. So the first, action-oriented, multimodal perception and the action-perception cycle. So what do I mean by these terms? Well, let's illustrate it by looking at these photos of Peter Zumthor's Therme at Vals in Switzerland. And what I want to emphasize is that we're seeing perception that is multimodal, that is directed in part to action and directed in part to aesthetic satisfaction. So as we look at, for example, the top right and the bottom left figures, we see that attractive blending of architecture and landscape. But the other 2 portions of the figure remind us that people are in this building to act. They're there to experience the thermal pools, to move from one pool to another. And in doing so, they're going to have the feel of the the stone beneath their feet. They're going to have the different thermal sensations of each pool. There will be, in some places, flowers floating in the water, which provide stimulation to the sense of smell. each place will have its own auditory qualities. And so we get that slogan of action-oriented multimodal perception. And the action-perception cycle is a conceptual framework. There's a lot in this figure, and I'm not going to explain it all. But the crucial point about a cycle is that you can start anywhere. So let's just start in the bottom right corner, where we have the idea of action is taking place, both to explore the environment, to move around the environment, and to act within the environment. And the crucial point as we follow the arrows is that as you act and look around and touch the world, so what you are experiencing of the present environment changes. And so that in turn is going to affect what you can experience, your perception. And as you perceive more about the world, you both change your understanding of the current circumstances and expand your knowledge of the world. And so that in turn affects how you act. And so it's not that stimulus yields response, but a continual cycle of action and perception. Just a couple of other data points to get that idea that we don't just look at the world and the world imposes itself on us, but our own mental state can have an effect. So this is a famous study by the Russian psychologist Yabus, who had people look at this classic painting by Repin. He was not expected. This is back in Tsarist times, but it was a man returning from the gulag of the day, and he was not expected. And what Yabus did that was interesting is he tracked people's eye movements, but asking a certain question of them as they did so. And so if you look at just looking around the picture, we see the eye traces at top. When we say, what are the ages of the people? We see that mainly the observer attends to the faces of each person to better estimate their age. But when the question is, remember the clothes worn by the people, then the faces just become anchor points for scanning up and down to commit to memory what is being looked at. So that again, that a crucial point that if you're designing, you're not designing just in terms of a total experience, you're designing with respect to the ongoing actions and shifts of attention, visual exploration, tactile exploration, and so on of the user. Let me indulge in just taking you through one bit of getting more detailed about the brain. In the book itself, there are several places where I do give expositions of how the brain works, or some fraction of how the brain works. But I am mindful that some of this will be interesting to the reader, and others will only appeal to some readers. So I carefully mark out those and recommend the general reader can just hum the material. So some of you might want to start humming as I go through this slide, but hopefully you'll find it interesting just as an example of how we can learn about the brain. So here, one way of learning about the human brain, but it turns out to be consistent with a lot of the studies my colleagues have done on monkey brains, where we get more details of circuitry. One of the ways you can learn about the brain is some poor person gets brain damage. And some of you have read Oliver Sacks, for example, on that. So in this case, the idea is a person is shown objects of different size, for example, some cylinders. And as the person reaches towards the cylinder, they're not only moving their hand towards the cylinder, they're already pre-shaping towards the appropriate size, so that the grasp is almost right for the size of the cylinder. So Jeanneret looked at one person who had had brain damage on the so-called dorsal pathway, going from the visual cortex up through the parietal cortex to the premotor cortex, and found there that the person lost the ability to come up with, if you will, the motor parameters, the how of the movement. How do you actually control the hand to the right shape and position? Whereas Goodale and Milner in Canada and Britain looked at a lesion to this pathway from visual cortex down to infratemporal cortex, and there they found that the person could not verbalize or pantomime the size of orientation. So but here's the strange thing: they couldn't tell you how big the cylinder was, but if you asked them to pick it up, they could still reach out and appreciate their hand perfectly and grab it. So there was this dissociation between being able to talk about, describe, pantomime even properties of objects, and to exploit those properties non-consciously to interact with the world. So that idea of how the brain can support both the conscious and the non-conscious and trying to understand how they interact has, I think, important implications. I'll return to that later. Now, the next theme I want to pick up of that 5 I listed before is the idea that even perception involves construction. So obviously with architecture, in the end, you want to have construction. The building will be constructed and then it will be experienced by people. But let's step back from that and think about it a bit more. So again, I'm going to turn to Peter Zumthor, but now not to a building, but to his essay, A Way of Looking at Things. And let's just look at a couple of points he made. Well, first, the interaction of whole and details. Interestingly, he says, unlike the sculptor, I have to start with functional and technical requirements. Though, of course, to be a good architect, one has to integrate those with something of the sculptor. And he talks about the challenge of developing a whole out of innumerable details. But as the details are designed, then they lead to new understandings of the whole. And so we get a virtuous circle then between the appreciation of the whole, appreciation of the details. But here's the crucial thing: constructions. Construction is the art of making a meaningful whole out of many parts. And what I want to do here then is make a shift to say that although the end point of the architect's work is physical construction, to get there, you need a process of mental construction. There are neurocognitive processes which underlie the design and both proceed and are interwoven with the actual building of the building. A classic example, not of design, but of how we interact with the world around us, including the built environment, is the notion of the body schema. This was something that came up in neurology in the work of 2 people named Head and Holmes, well over 100 years ago. And here's what they said about the body schema. It's anything which participates in the conscious movement of our bodies, is added to the model of ourselves and become part of those schemata. A woman's power of localization may extend to the feathers of her hat. Well, we don't see too many examples of such hats today, but if we get into a motor car and we know it for a while, then while we are in the car, our body schema extends to the perimeter of the car. If we use a tool, a screwdriver, for example, our body schema extends to the tip of the screwdriver. And conversely, as we move in the environment, our body schema automatically, as it were, adjusts. So that if, just like the lady with the feathered hat, if we come to a doorway that's a little too low, then we may duck our head appropriately to get through. So the suggestion is that while a lot of neurology and neuroscience has thought about the body schema, as it were, outward from the body, I think there's a very rich study for the conversation in having more thought about how the architecture of the built environment provides constraints to the way in which our body schema allows us to act under different circumstances. Let me just give you one more piece of neurology. This is a study by Bisiak and Luzzati in Milano in 1978. And there are people who actually had the problem that had motivated Head and Holmes, called hemi-neglect. You have a lesion in this area of the brain. Again, we don't worry about the details, but if they had a lesion there, then they could neglect half their body. So the person putting clothes on might put clothes on one side of the body and then neglect to put the clothes on the other half of the body. But what Bisiak and Luzzati said was, this is not just a matter of experience, it extends to memory. And so here was this: they would ask people to say, imagine that you are standing facing the Duomo in Milano. Tell us what you see. And they would come up with a pretty accurate description of what was on the unneglected side. of the Duomo. So you might think, okay, they'd lost their memory of half the space around the Duomo. But then they said, this is the brilliance of it, said, turn around, now imagine what you can see. And then they could describe the other half. So it turned out there was this interaction between representing half the body while you're acting and representing half of what the body can experience. So I put a slogan here, which I call dissecting phenomenology. A lot of people in architecture, quite rightly, will tell you of the importance of phenomenology, understanding how people experience life and the environment and the universe and everything. But what I want to say is that what neuroscience gives us is the insight that, in fact, the phenomenology is not just an integrative experience. It's the illusion of an integrative experience. The brain is employing many different mechanisms to make you experience the world. And perhaps as we understand better what the different contributions are that can be made to that experience, so we can get new ideas for how to provide rich new experiences in architecture. Okay. Well, what about this slogan, perception as construction? Look at these two figures. You have no conscious perception, I think, of recognizing either of them. In each case, you see a distinctive castle atop a hill or a mountain. But if we take the second view and expand it, we find Magritte's Château de Périmie. And you can't handle it anymore. Yeah, if you look just at the top half, you're seeing a castle atop a mountain. But if you look at the bottom half, here is this monstrous boulder crashing into the sea. And so what has been done here by Magritte is to use local realism to battle the global constraints that normally let you, and often non-consciously, make sense of the different parts of a scene and put them together. So we do have an account called Visions, of understanding a visual scene as a process of mental construction. And let me just briefly give you a sense of that, too briefly perhaps, but this goes back to work of Hansen and Reisman. But I still think, although it was a very primitive AI model, it still gives us a sense of the interactions that I believe the brain really involves. Now, notice what I just said. I said what I believe that the brain really involves. Neuroscience is not a fixed body of established facts and understandings. It is something that is evolving every day. Hundreds of new papers are published, which enrich our understanding, contradict old understandings, demand us to make sense of how they cohere and so on. Anyway, here's the point. It's a long-standing understanding, if you'll forgive the phrasing, that early visual processing in the primate, the monkey and the human, at the level of the first place, the visual cortex, that information from the retina reaches the cerebral cortex, that it can come up with an estimate of edges in the scene. And so on that basis, some of us have developed algorithms which say, okay, here are all these little neurons saying, I think there's an edge here, I think there's an edge there. And we can use that to come up with the idea for where contours are that separate one region of interest from another. So that's the sort of low-level vision point shown here. And in this particular diagram, you'll see a disturbing fact that because in this picture, the roof and the sky have very similar coloration, but in particular, we lose this particular edge here. And so what happens is then processes still, in many cases, non-conscious, will start trying to grab regions of the image. And I use the jargon perceptual schemas. The book contains an account of schema theory of how it bridges from neurons below to social constructs above. But here the point is, just to give you a quick example, our knowledge of the world is that if we see an outdoor scene, then if there's something bluish, grayish, or in Los Angeles, smoggish, high in the image, then that's likely to be sky. And that if we see something that is just below the sky, then it's likely to be a roof. But in this particular processing, it was the case that because the color of this was pretty much the same as the color of this could have been a region high in the image of the right color to be sky. So further interaction gets us to the point where the recognition of these shapes of the shutters and so on settles the question. And now we know this is wall, this is roof, this is sky, but problem, hey, you said this was sky and now you're saying it's wall, and now this requires a shift of attention to focus on there and more clearly see the edge. And as I say, that's all or much of it non-conscious until you see as an explicit contradiction. Okay. So now the next topic I want to come in, which really focuses on the notion of action-oriented perception, but also it turns out brings in emotion and the setting of mood, is affordances. And so this was an idea coined in the 1970s by the psychologist J.J. Gibson. And the idea is that perception is often thought of in terms of, oh, what can I see here? What is it? But if I'm walking down Las Ramblas, as shown here, then in fact, there may be actions that do involve cognition, if you will, active perception. I find it very hard to avoid noticing in the middle of the view a woman in yellow, and then I might pay attention to the fact that she's wearing a handbag and so on. But if as I continue walking, I may suddenly jump to the side because my peripheral vision has signaled to me an imminent collision. The process is called optic flow, and it's an example by Gibson. You don't have to go through a cognitive analysis of a scene to get information that provides affordances that tell you what to do. And it's a little bit like the early example we had of reaching for an object, where on the one hand you may see, oh, this is let's say a cup. There's the handle. I want to grasp it by the handle. And then the totally non-conscious processes that get you to shape your hand appropriately, adapting to the position and size of the handle. Another jargon piece is effectivities. What can you do affects what you can recognize as an opportunity for. So if you come to a flight of stairs, most of you will recognize that as an opportunity to get to the next floor. If you're in a wheelchair, you may recognize it sort of conceptually as a way others could get to that floor, but it won't be an invitation to action for yourself. Okay, so let me jump this because I'm talking much more than I should, and just jump to the notion of atmosphere. And so the idea is that we don't just experience architecture in terms of what actions does it make possible, a door to go through, a flight of stairs to climb, and so on, but our mood can be set by the buildings, and that's referred to as the atmosphere of the building. And here I distinguish just two. On the left, we see a temple garden in Kyoto, a mood of serenity and contemplation. On the right, we see Edinburgh Castle, which may engage us in our mood as tourists. But if we had been confronting it as soldiers of an opposing army trying to storm it, then it would be indeed an atmosphere of fortitude and foreboding, if you will. And I already mentioned a workshop that Juhani hosted in Helsinki. The sequel to that was one on architecture and atmosphere. And one of the speakers there, Tonino Grifero from Rome, and we have a little booklet coming out in the near future together, but he suggested that we think of atmosphere as an architectural affordance. And so the idea is that it conveys, it establishes a mood, if it will. It relates more to emotion than to overt action. But the idea, and again, going far beyond what we can explore today, is that this interaction of the setting of the mood, the emotion setting of a space, and the opportunities for action within that space all contribute to what we, in experience in the building, will do within our action perception cycle, which will be guided perhaps by particular goals we have in entering that building. Just one more piece of atmosphere. This is Alvaro Caesar's Boa Nova, originally designed as a coffee house, now, much to his disgust, taken over as a very expensive restaurant. But it creates an atmosphere that is not only the atmosphere of the building itself, but the way in which it blends and yet is different from the environment in which it is placed. Okay, one more topic that is slightly related to this, we've already gone from what does the building itself do to us to what does the building set in its environment do to us. And let's just close that thought with, well, in general, we don't experience isolated buildings by ourselves. In general, there are other people. And in fact, we might say that one of the most important aspects of buildings, one that is often lacking in urban design today, is that of building a sense of community. And so here's the Kampong Admiralty created by the Singapore firm Woha, in which we see, for example, that we have biophilia in the sense of a strong use of foliage to improve the expression and provide shade. We have not only apartments for seniors, but we have between them buddy benches so that people can come out from their own apartments and mingle with their neighbors. At the bottom, there are shops where, again, people can mingle. And the notion of system of systems, this is not only that there are many interacting portions of this building, but it is part of the housing system, of the urban transportation system, of the electricity system, of the water system, and so on, of the island state of Singapore. So that notion of systems is something that really reverberates, I think, between our understanding of complex buildings and the placing of those complex buildings in complex environments, but also the way we think about the brain of people as individuals and the brains of peoples in concert forming a community. And here's some linkage to the architecture of the brain itself, architecture in the other sense, but not for today. Okay, one more topic, and this links to the third of the workshops that Juhani hosted, this one on architecture and empathy. And we see three names we've already encountered: Ballasmar, Mulgrave, and Robinson, but the last name is that of Vittorio Gallese, and he is a member. He is the second from the right of this group of 5 people who were studying the cortex, the premotor cortex, whatever that means, of the monkey, and found that there were cells that not only responded for seeing, not only responded for seeing, for when the monkey itself executed an action, preparing a particular action of its own. Here we see 10 different trials, the vigorous firing of the neuron in each of these trials, a histogram that shows the overall behavior. Here we see, oh, it's the experimenter who's doing the grasping, and yet, amazingly, we still get vigorous activities. They call these neurons, and there are many other kinds of neurons in that part of the brain, but they call these neurons that fired both for a particular kind of action executed by the monkey and also for a similar action executed by the another that the monkey is observing. They're called the mirror neurons. So they're responsive during action and during observation of action of a particular kind. And this has sparked, interestingly, and this is why I keep insisting, if we want to understand the human brain, we need to understand what's going on in animal brains, because this led to a great deal of brain imaging in which people ask, well, I can't look at individual neurons in the human brain. What I can do is say, is there a chunk of the brain that when I do brain imaging lights up more for, let's say, hand movements and for action of hand movements than for other things, whereas other parts of the brain might light up for carrying out actions but not for observing them, and vice versa. And so again, one of my, I think, main efforts has been, and again, to remind experimenters who found lovely neurons that if you want to understand not just, oh, here are lovely neurons, but here's how those neurons work, you need to think about the rest of the brain. And so I've taken this illustration from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass to say that there are many regions beyond the mirror, and it's their integrated activity that occurs. Here's just one example. So over here, we see a man, a monkey, and a dog biting something, and the subject views these videos while their brain is being scanned, the human brain being scanned, the three types of creature providing the stimulus. And what we see is that the mirror region for biting is active whether you see a man biting, pardon me, a human, a monkey biting, or a dog biting, or a man drinking. Whereas over here we have no sound, just the video, a human talking, a monkey doing communicative mouth gestures like lip smacking, teeth chattering, and a dog barking. And here you see that we get a lot of mirror neuron activity for watching the human, just a touch for watching the monkey, and nothing for watching the dog. So Buccino and the others who conducted this brain imaging study said, well, there are two sorts of systems. Actions belonging to the motor repertoire of the observer, such as biting and speaking, are mapped on the observer's motor system. Actions that do not belong to this repertoire, such as barking, are recognized without mapping. And I say, no, all actions are recognized by a system outside the mirror system that sort of makes sense of what's going on. But if you want to link it to the parameters of your own action, then that's where the mirror system comes into play. All right. Well, as always, I prepared too many slides, and so I'm going to skip the implications that are spelled out in the book, where Mulgrave and Galeazzi explore what we can do in relating mirror systems, in other words, the place where mirror neurons occur in humans, to empathy, and what this might mean for our appreciation of art. So let me just quickly look at these without getting into the details. They're spelled out in the book. Here's the Laocoon. Here we might say our appreciation of this statue is that in some sense we feel ourselves the strenuous action of the father and sons in trying to escape the coils of the serpent. But at the same time, we appreciate, if we get to see the real statue and look up closely, the smoothness whereby the sculptor has removed all trace of his own work. Now, Galatians and so would say, well, look, when you look at this painting by Fontana, you actually see the cuts he made in the canvas when preparing this. And you feel that, and that trace of the actions of the painter enrich your appreciation. But a little later, after reading this paper, I happened to encounter a similar work of Fontana's in San Diego. And here we see that, in fact, there are not cuts, but there are grooves in the canvas filled in with black paint. And so, again, we see that we are in a place where we have both what is the intended effect of the artist, and what are the actions, whether by the artist or by what is represented in the painting, that have that action on us. But anyway, the idea that action recognition and empathy can both play a role. And thus the insights we've been getting from going beyond the monkey to this larger appreciation beyond the mirror in the human brain can help us understand issues in aesthetics, which might be lost if we were taking a purely visual approach. What does the eye see to that aesthetics without thinking about, but what does the eye tell us about ongoing actions? Okay, and to close this part, let me just say that another aspect of the discussion is the interaction between affordances and symbolism. I'm not quite sure I can tease those apart yet, but the idea is here's a library. You're invited to ascend the stairs to get to the library. You enter the main doors. You're ascending these stairs to this great hall. And so you are given, in some sense, the notion of ascending to a realm of knowledge. And yet when you get in the stacks, all that grand symbolism disappears. But if you're of a certain turn of mind, there's an excitement of losing your way in the stacks, and then by chance coming upon a book or books that capture your fascination. Okay. And so continuing with our saga, I want to come to episodic memory and imagination, and the mental construction of architectural design. So here we have data that I mentioned earlier in passing. John O'Keefe, in work that later achieved the Nobel Prize in collaboration with later work by other colleagues, was studying the rat hippocampus with his colleague Dostrovsky. And so this is a drawing by Ramon Cajal from about 1899 of a cross-section through this region of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus gets its name because it looks vaguely like a seahorse, hippocampus. What they found was that certain cells had this fascinating property that what seemed to correlate with their firing was not what the rat was doing or what the rat saw, but where the rat was in the arena. And so here's a later schematization that the tracery is the rat moving around this square arena, and the dots are where the cells fire. And so there's an interesting question of how do you take multiple cells to get from this very coarse localization to a very fine localization? And then my group did modeling to say, yes, but this is sort of like knowing where you are, but navigation requires you've got to know where you want to be and figure out from that the necessary material to get from where you are to where you want to be. So again, we get the idea that here's an incredibly important body of findings in neuroscience. Here are here's the challenge of going from that to really modeling, if you will, the little robot running around representing a rat, or making sense of what's going on in our heads as we find our way around. The most famous insight into the human was from this work of which studied this guy named H.M., who had such massive epilepsy that his surgeon got carried away, and instead of trying to make a small lesion of the brain, carved out this huge area on both sides that included the hippocampus. And intriguingly, H.M. lost his ability to create new episodic memory. In other words, he could remember episodes in his life from the past, but from there on, he could not create memories of new episodes. But he could, this is intriguing, with other parts of the brain, and getting in again to that idea of system of systems, he could form new procedures. So if you played a game with him every day, he would never remember playing the game before, but he would become increasingly skillful at playing that game. Okay, I really don't want to overburden you because I know some of you already have questions, so I'm going to just race through the remaining slides to indicate basically what is in the last two chapters of the book. So we've got the challenge of how do we reconcile ideas of wayfinding in space and wayfinding in time, episodic memory. And then we get into the idea of how does our memory of the past inform our imagination for the future. And perhaps this is relevant, that one of our delights, a bit like those stacks in the library, one of our delights when we're not under time pressure is getting lost. Venice is perhaps the best urban example of that. And maybe that is in a way imagination, that you're exploring new experiences and building up then your new appreciation of this amazing city. Okay. All right, I want to introduce one more concept, and that is of script. And this turns out to be important. Lina Bobardi is an Italian-born architect who flourished in Brazil for many years. And this is her art museum in Sao Paulo. And the architecture is quite striking here. But what is interesting is when you get inside the museum, you find that the paintings, instead of being arrayed along the walls, are placed on glass sheets held up by concrete foundations. Similarly, as you enter the museum, instead of finding what you expect in the museum, sort of a grand entrance with stairs like that library we looked at, sweeping up to the entrance, we find, no, this is all reserved for a public space to be used by the people. And you can eventually recognize there's an elevator and stairs at the end. So there are sort of standard scripts saying this is how you behave in a building. And what she has done is she's taken those scripts and changed them. And then she's created an architecture that exercises those scripts. And what I want to emphasize then is another quote from Zumta, who says, when I think about architecture, images come to my mind. When I design, I frequently find myself sinking into old, half-forgotten memories. Yet at the same time, I know that all is new, and yet there is no direct reference to a formal work of architecture. And in some sense, I'm trying to think about the building in terms of what are the narratives of prior experience the architect brings to it? What are the narratives that you, when you use or inhabit that building later, will gain from it? But the architect does not put in the individual narratives. He must extract, or she must extract, scripts. What are the general patterns of behavior or the general patterns of experience you can expect for people? Then how do you build a building which will afford those experiences or support those courses of action? Think about the difference between a school, a library, a restaurant, and so on. And they will also provide that opportunity, if you want a rich experience, for way losing, for making your own discovery of affordances that weren't particularly intended, but make things better. So I have two case studies in chapter 9. One is showing Yun Utzon's design of the Sydney Opera House and trying to look at the images that come to mind, the relation of water to a large building on land that he experienced when sailing around Helsingfors in his native Denmark, the way in which we have pillar, roof, and building in between of a Chinese temple, and the boats that his father, a marine architect, designed. And what I want to claim, looking at this picture, is that the inspiration for the shells was not so much the sails here as the hull turned on its side. Well, of course, no one of these things is causal, but we try to understand what the architect was doing by bringing these images to mind. Turning to Frank Gehry's Bilbao, we can look at the ways in which his sketching and his model making and the interaction that he had with people around him in the office contributed to the emergence of a design that satisfied but went so far beyond the needs of his client. And I recently made a field trip just a few weeks ago to Sydney, where I, in some sense, bring together those two case studies from the book by looking at Gehry in Sydney, where he designed this business school, new business school for the University of Technology, Sydney. And I had the privilege there of meeting with the former deans of architecture in the business school who'd worked with Gehry during the design process. And what I want to emphasize there is another challenge for us to think about more explicitly in our conversation is the interaction between clients and architects. How is it that in some sense we start with an architect who's perhaps not thought at all about the design of business schools, and clients who surely in their wildest dreams could not have thought of this as the form of a business school. And yet as they come between them, we end up with a building that is both highly functional and yet highly sculptural at the same time. Okay, let me not get into that further, but simply conclude that this has been a conversation about a conversation. And that I want to suggest that the conversation in the book is intended for all of you. It's not requiring that you be a specialist in architecture or a specialist in neuroscience, but the hope is that whatever your specialization, or your just interest as a member of the general public who experiences buildings and wonders about their brains, that this little book that will be worth your attention. So thank you very much for the attention you have given me so far, and I would be happy now to take any questions that you have to offer.
Well, Michael, that was fascinating. I have lots of questions, as I'm sure any number of people in the audience do, but a lot to think about, needless to say. And while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, I wondered, Michael, you know that you also know me through the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design, and it seems to me, I did a little back of the envelope math here, which is probably wrong, which would be fitting that I make an addition error to you. But it would seem that, Richard Neutra was writing about this, this intersection of neuroscience and architecture some 70 years ago, when you were just really starting your career, and clearly all the advances that have been made in those, that half decade, if you will. Can you quickly give us a sense of your take on, what did Neutra get right about some of this without all the advantages of the technology and the experiments and the body of work that's come after him?
Well, firstly, I have to confess that I only encountered the work of Neutra for the first time at the Taliesin West meeting, where I met Barbara Lamprecht, who's written a lot on the subject, and she in turn introduced me to Raymond Neutra, Richard Neutra's son. But in reading the original book from 1954, I'm struck by how deeply Neutra thought about the issues of architecture from his own deep experience there, but a wide reading in philosophy, psychology, and a little bit of neuroscience at that time. And so I would say that now that I've had the experience of reading his book, in a sense, after my initial ideas were formed rather than before it, I'm delighted at the consonance between them. Mm-hmm. And as you know, I've been invited to give a talk on this on November 5th. And we'll try by then to have an hour-long answer to your question.
Well said. Well said. I was also fascinated by your description of the importance of examining and analyzing animal brains in addition to the human brain, and how that enriches our understanding of the human brain. And this is, once again, you quickly identify the fact that I graduated from the Wally Thor School of Trucking, not from MIT here, but just in my own layperson's experience of having spent time in what I'd call traditional houses with punched openings and that kind of thing, and then moving to a house that had floor-to-ceiling glass. One of the first things that I noticed was how the animals reacted to what we know to be mid-century modern architecture. And I'm just curious if there have been any experiments or studies that study how animals react to buildings.
Well, perhaps the most publicized work is that on all these birds that kill themselves flying into glass buildings, and what one can do as an architect to respond to them. Now, that's a different question, though, from what I was saying, right?
Yes.
I'm saying that if you want to understand the human brain, then it's helpful to incorporate lessons from the animal brain. But I would say distinguished colleagues like Harry Mulgrave say, well, in a sense, once you've got to that new understanding of the human brain, I don't care where it came from.
I see.
So it's a bit like, I suppose, if I'm experiencing a building, the fact that it has a certain form of foundation, the fact that certain girders were placed that I can't see, mm-hmm. may not be important to me. So, but the idea of a conversation is both, you say, where's the common ground, but also, can we perhaps enrich the conversation by you telling me more about the architecture and me telling you more about the neuroscience? And I don't think you can really understand neuroscience if you restrict it to just the human neuroscience. In the same way, if you're concerned with medicine, if you do human behavior and don't do any genetics or molecular biology, you're not going to understand how to design and make use of new drugs. So depending on where you are, you bring in different realms of knowledge.
Interesting. So we have one of our attendees was very interested in what you were saying about affordances. And a question was, could you say a bit more about how affordances build mood?
Okay. I wouldn't say affordances build mood. I'd say we're saying the same general term, affordances, can build action, and another kind of affordance builds emotion, and the two interact. To give you an example, if you have a new gadget, okay, then on the one hand, literally, then as you try to use that gadget, the feel in your hand, the efficacy with which it allows you to achieve your goal, these relate more to the practical aspects. But the way it looks, and perhaps aspects of how it feels, there's both the feel of this feels comfortable in my hand and the feel of I can get a good grip on this object.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so the idea is we can explore then in looking at a space, both the emotional impact, the mood setting, and the practical aspect. I think a lot of writers talk to a great extent about the visual impact of a space, which sets into the aesthetic or the affordances for atmosphere, but neglects that. And that goes back to that quote I made of Sumter, that unlike the sculptor, I have to worry about these other aspects. And so in a sense, I'm trying to bring together these two aspects. And then Tonino Grafero said, okay, let's call them both affordances, but where one is, we're emphasizing the emotional impact, the other we're emphasizing the practical impact.
Okay. So here we have a comment, wonderful talk. Perhaps Michael could develop a little more on the topic of body schema in connection, the experience of the pandemic, specifically the way most of us became increasingly more attached and dependent to media, which made a lot of our body movement rather small and limited from an ergonomics perspective. Oh, it's very interesting. But with an incredible amount of emotional development on the inside. How do you think our brains changed through the process, and what implications can this have for future design, since home office became also a post-COVID reality for many?
I'm not sure I have any professionally grounded things to say about that. The exploration of that would be, in a sense, that notion of linking affordances and effectivities, right? The idea is what you can see in the environment depends not only what you want to do, but also on what you know you can do. You're in a wheelchair, you see that flight of stairs. Yes, you may love to go up it and stride up it as you see others do, but you can't. So you instead learn new strategies of looking for that ramp, of getting yourself safely up the ramp and so on. So that's a general process of plasticity. And the point that I've emphasized elsewhere is that the body schema is not to be thought of as one thing. It really is a huge collection of what I call perceptual and motor schemas, that you can recognize things, you can do certain things. So that one of the examples I talked about was you get in that car. Now your body schema morphs to take advantage of that as you now have new ways of action as you drive a car, and you have new perceptions. And similarly, as once you grab that screwdriver, your body schema changes and your actions change, because you can now do things with screws that you couldn't do before. So I would say that's the general framework in which we could answer that question. That, okay, you can't go out of the room, but you want something. Okay, you learn there's a different strategy. You use a delivery app, and you get that thing that you would otherwise get. And then in the post-COVID period, you can then say, okay, I've actually got back my old affordances, but now I have new affordances that I acquired during the epidemic, and now I have to decide how to balance them. Will I lose some of the new ones in favor of restoring the old ones, vice versa, or will I come up with new strategies because I have this enriched experience?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly true. Yes. Exactly. We're getting a little bit of feedback here, which is unfortunate.
I think somebody needs to turn off their microphone.
Yeah, could everybody just make sure that your microphones are off? Thank you very much. Oh, okay, so here's an interesting question. It says, in an hour, I will go see the movie Don't Worry, Darling. filmed in my father's Kaufman house. Okay, I think we know who this is from. It was intended for the delight and relaxation of Edgar Kaufman, but the art director of the movie saw it as an idea for affording terror. What's going on here?
I think the idea is that atmosphere is not fixed.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, you take a space and you see it in an open space, and it's bright daylight and there are other people around, the place can be delightful. Take that same space, it's nighttime, there's little illumination, and you hear footsteps coming up behind you, and the atmosphere is totally changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think what we're saying then is the totality. If you're designing a building, you have to be thinking about it in terms of who will be in it. So that if you're trying to get a certain atmosphere, it's with respect to those people that will be there with you, and how that will create a certain feeling. And so what the director here is seeing, that the same three-dimensional structure, in fact, becomes atmospherically a completely different space once you change what the lighting is, who is in there with you, and maybe a little mood music to help the transition.
Well, I think without knowing, you've actually perfectly set up a promo for next week's talk, where we'll be exploring how Alfred Hitchcock did exactly that through architecture. So it'll be an interesting sort of continuation of some of the themes that you've set up for us today. So I just want to remind everyone, this is the book. As you can see, there was a whole lot he couldn't go into today because it's very meaty, very, very meaty here. And so just a reminder, you can receive a 30% discount from Oxford University Press. We will resend that information because you may have lost it or what have you, and now we're just chomping at the bit to buy the book. And so please go to the University Press website URL and put in the promo code that we're going to send you, and you'll get your discount. Michael, thank you so much for this today. We will also promote your upcoming November 5th talk for the Neutra Institute to anyone who might be interested in following on and hearing that hour-long response to the question I asked. So we will share that out as well. And thank you again for all of your work. I really appreciate it. Again, you've given us a lot to think about. I can tell you that.
Thank you for the chance to be here.
Take care. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.